In this module, we shall discuss about Swan solo model. Before criticizing a specific model or even evaluating its success, it is important to understand the different historical methods of economic development. Very different paths to economic development have been kept since the Industrial Revolution. The first participants in the Industrial Revolution experienced very productive agricultural sectors which created surpluses. These surpluses allowed for specialization in other industries. These countries were the first to develop structured market and took an export-led industrialization path. Late participants in the Industrial Revolution suffered from a less productive agricultural sector, had less advanced market and institutions, and had to rely on inward growth due to lack of trade. Many land-scarce countries throughout history have suffered from low productivity and experienced massive poverty. Others have benefited from balanced growth in agriculture and industry, allowing them to build developed market and rely on a diverse export-led economy. Economists have learned from history. The most successful countries benefited from more developed markets, high factory endowments, human resources, and political systems receptive to capitalism. At the end of World War II, the ideologies of the United States and the Soviet Union were at odds. The two superpowers could not reach an agreement on how to construct the economies destroyed by the war. The development strategies produced in the United States sought to contain communism while spreading to capitalism throughout the world. The conflict that ensued came to be known as the World War, and development strategy was only one of many areas in which this clash played out. Years after the Cold War, prevailing development models still compete against the communist theory. One such model is the neoclassical development model. Rooted in early economic thought, neoclassical development aims to spur economic growth through government support. A series of market failures in the 1960s led to the idea that the government should provide infrastructure to support the market. Based on theory of neoclassical economics, this model aims to construct organized markets to increase productivity and development. It hinges on the idea that investment will increase the growth rate of per capita output. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the concept of Swan solo model, learn the various aspects of growth, identify the important features of the growth, evaluate the growth model, analyze the growth path. First, we shall discuss the neoclassical development model. The neoclassical development model is centered on neoclassical economic theory. Neoclassical economics focuses on prices, output, and income distributions in markets determined through supply and demand. The primary goal of neoclassical economics is to provide efficient allocation of scarce resources. It assumes an individual rationality enables them to maximize their utility or profit. An emphasis is placed on equilibrium. The interactions of consumers and firms in a free market should dwell in an equilibrium quantity and supply. The architects of neoclassical development model knew that highly developed markets and institutions were needed for the theory to work. It calls for the government to accumulate capital by removing trade barriers and encouraging foreign direct investments. Once capital is accumulated, it should flow from areas of low productivity to area of high productivity. As per capita productivity grows, economic growth will ensue. This is only a brief synopsis of the model, but it illustrates the basic assumptions made. The neoclassical development model points us in the right direction. It recognizes the importance of advanced markets and institutions to economic growth. History has demonstrated their importance. It also recognizes the importance of free trade to economic growth. The major contributors to the neoclassical theory of growth have been R. M. Solo, T. W. Swan, J. R. Hicks, and J. E. Meade. addressing an American Economic Association celebrating the 50th anniversary of his 1956 contribution to the theory of economic growth, Robert Solow reminded his audience that if you have been interested in growth theory for a while, you probably know that theory in 1956. In that article, for the first time, the essentials of basic neoclassical model of economic growth has given. Swan's contribution initially won international academic recognition. He was a visiting professor at MIT in 1958. Despite the generous efforts of Robert Solow, Swan's work on growth theory has been overshadowed, at least outside Australia, by Solow. Textbooks and classroom presentations discuss the steady state equilibrium path of the neoclassical growth model in terms of capital labor ratio as in Solow rather than the output capital ratio as in Swan. In 1945, around the time of Australian white paper on employment policy, Swan wrote a memorandum on principle of effective demand, a real life model published posthumously in 1989. This paper laid down the first macroeconomic model of the Australian economy. While still chief economist in the Prime Minister's department, Swan made his first venture into trying to reach some understanding of the theory underlying any policy of economic development with a 16-page memorandum entitled Size and Composition of Investment and the Industrial Distribution of Labor in a Closed Progressive Economy. Although no formal mathematical model was written down, the discussion involved several formal assumptions including saving is a constant proportion of income and unaffected by the rate of interest, complete mobility of labor, constant physical returns from land, full employment, no innovation. Setting saving equal to investment, Swan reasoned using a simple numerical example that if capital and population is increasing at the same rate, then population increase will wholly exhaust net investment and capital and output per head will remain constant. In this case, the increment of consumption demanded is an increment in the existing average consumption in proportion to the rate of population increase. But most of the analysis is concerned with a more complicated but policy relevant case in which marginal consumption as real income rises is biased towards specific uses such as housing. According to him, consumption goods were divided into three categories: houses produced with capital alone, manufacturers produced with current labor, and capital in the form of machinery and services produced with current labor alone. The capital used to produce housing and manufacture embodies past labor services classified as building and engineering services respectively. Capital and labor are substitutable in the production of manufactures. However, given the difficulties of verbal analysis, it is not surprising that the general equilibrium effect of an increase in capital on relative factor prices and hence on the proportion of labor and capital in manufacturing is ignored. He argued that if the population is constant but at the margin desires only increased housing, all increment in capital are diverted to housing and capital per head will remain constant in the manufactures. However, if the population desires only more manufactures, then all next investment is machine and capital per head will rise steadily in manufactures, which will have constant current labor. If it is services that people desire marginally, then all net investment is in machinery for manufacture, but the increase in capital per head and output per head in manufactures means that the manpower must be released from manufacturers to production to services. Moving on to the Harrod-Domer model. As stated by the Harrod-Domer model, steady states and stability, in which the most powerful and characteristic and powerful conclusion is that even for a long run, the economic system which assumed fixed coefficient production technologies that gave their models knife edge equilibrium with the plausible implication that any deviation at all from equilibrium would cause the model to diverge further and further away from the equilibrium. There are so many economists who have given solution to the disequilibrium. Among them, one of the pioneer was Swan. Now we shall discuss the Swan model. The original contribution of Swan was not the elimination of Harrod-Domer knife edge by making the output capital and capital labor ratio endogenous rather than Swan created a simple, convenient and powerful apparatus for finding the steady Swan growth path of a one community world. Swan 1956 demonstrates the importance of technical progress for long run growth. In considering technical progress, Swan introduces a third factor, land, which is fixed and simply and hence induces diminishing returns. Swan considers the rate of technical progress that is necessary to prevent population pressure from moving the economy to a Malthusian outcome. A higher saving rate and a faster accumulation capital raises the growth rates at every point, but only temporarily interrupts the inevitable progress towards the stationary state determined by technical progress. Swan notices that the model makes technical progress a powerful way of improving the standard of living and capital accumulation a disconcertingly weak need. He looks for an answer to his anti-accumulation pro-technology line of argument and mentioned two possibilities. One is very classical. If higher output per head will induce faster growth of the labor force, then something like Arthur Lewis' unlimited supply of labor is present and additional capital accumulation becomes much more powerful. His second idea is that the rate of technical progress may not be independent of the rate of accumulation of capital, or accumulation may give rise to external economies so that the true social yield of capital is greater than any plausible figure based on common private experience. This point would have appealed to Adam Smith, but it will not be pursued here. Trevor Swan independently developed the standard neoclassical growth model. Swan was published 10 months later than Robert Solow, but included a more complete analysis of technical progress. Swan is able to directly illustrate the effects of variation in the rate of technical progress. Swan was also involved in the developing the constant elasticity of substitution production function, of which Cobb-Douglas elasticity of substitution equal to 1 and Leontief fixed coefficient technology means zero elasticity of substitution. In deciding on the contribution of economic analysis, whether theory or econometric estimation, Swan placed a huge weight on importance of the work for economic policy in addition to requirement for originality and rigor. Swan 1964 growth models of golden ages and production functions prepared for the roundtable conference in 1960 in Japan explains some of the inadequacies of growth model for practical development. It is also likely that Swan's interest in further contribution to the growth literature was reduced by the frustrations of dealing with the bureaucracy while working on the India's 5-year plan in 1958. Swan had first to develop a composite growth model in which he had introduced some deeper detriments of the growth which varies from country to country. Those factors are basically non-economic factors which can be classified into 4 broad categories are geographical, institutional, political and cultural. Geographical differences are perhaps the most obvious. He has emphasized countries that are landlocked, that suffers from a hazardous disease environment and that have difficult obstacles in the way of internal transportation will almost certainly produce at a lower level than countries without these problems, even if they use the same technology and the same area of capital. In addition, the lower productivity of these countries will serve to reduce the rate of return to accumulating capital and to generating new technologies. Institutions matter because of the way they affect private contracts and also because of the way they affect the extent to which the returns to different kinds of investments can be appropriated by the government. In long run, productivity growth requires technical progress. It depends on political, institutional and regulatory factors that affect the way the conflict between the winners and the losers of technical progress will be resolved and hence affect the incentives to create and adopt new technologies. Economic policies matters not only because of the way they affect the returns to investing in capital and technology, but also because of the inefficiencies that can be created by taxes and subsidies. but how these policies affect economic growth can vary from one country to another. Culture is a difficult factor to measure. In principle, however, it is capable of explaining a great deal of cross-country variation in growth, because a society in which people are socialized to trust each other, to work hard, to value technical expertise, and to respect law and order is certainly going to be thriftier and more productive. Among the neoclassical economists, Solow was too impressed by the growth model developed by Swan that he has given all credit to Swan for the neoclassical model of growth. The model developed by Swan and Solow has such similarities that the model of growth named as Swan-Solow model, but Solow model has overshadowed on Swan model of development. Though there is some different approach of the theory, but due to similarities, the approach is known as Swan-Solow model of the growth. The growth model is saying that the economy is self-stable and the equilibrium comes naturally. Further, we discuss the results and drawbacks of Swan-Solow model. This model actually shows how the rate of economic growth, the population growth and the technological progress influence the economic growth during a certain period of time. The premises used in this model are: the economy is perfectly competitive. There are two production factors which are perfectly substitutable: work, labor and capital K. In the initial analysis does not appear the technical progress. The perfect mobility of the production factors, complete employment in using the resources. The model takes into consideration a closed economy with a single sector in which the homogeneous production has as destination either they consume or the investments in order to create new capital units, and the savings are equal to the investments. The capital will have a constant and positive depreciation rate. According to the neoclassical theory, the saving rate will not affect the long-term rate of economic growth, but will long-term influence the level of output capita. According to this theory, the saving rate represents one of the main indicators of an economy, but it reflects the level of financial education of one nation. If the saving rate is high, of course the amount of income for the consume is more reduced. The major drawback of the theory of Swan model is overlook of behavioral economics. The psychological fundamentals underlying the human behavior determined the population who was facing a threat and so was mentally forced to take precautions measures in order to avoid being unprepared in the following period. Another big problem of the model aiming to explain the economic growth and to offer recovering scenario is represented by the implementation of these models. There are big gaps of the transfer of knowledge between those who develop models, academic world, researchers, and those who are supposed to ensure the smooth running of the economy, both government and the business community. The key criticism of Swan model of development should be in the scope of its assumption. There are a wide range of problems faced by the developing countries, and this model addresses very few of them. It succeeds in creating an economy receptive to capitalism but fails to benefit the population as a whole. There is a historical evidence showing developed markets and advanced institutions are crucial to economic development. How about the accumulation of human capital or the effects of corruption? The neoclassical development model failed to address these issues. Barriers to economic development are not always measurable. The greatest failure seems to be its reliance on weak sustainability. Weak sustainability is a fairly simple premise which states overall capital stock should be non-decreasing. It allows for natural resources to be completely depleted as long as other forms of capital compensate for this loss. A country could be quickly find itself on a track to unsustainable development. Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. In a steady state, GDP per worker will be higher in countries where the rate of investment is high and where the population growth rate is low, but neither factor should explain differences in the growth rate of GDP per worker. It is easy to see that Harrod-Domer equation is the special case of Cobb-Douglas equation, that the elasticity of output with respect to labor equal to 0 and elasticity of output with respect to capital equals 1. The Solow-Swan model implies that the growth of income per capita cannot be sustained without continued technological progress. Its perspective on the strategy of economic development is entirely different from the Harrod-Domer model that identifies capital accumulation as an engine of development. Clearly, the differences stems from different assumptions of the production function.